Hi, this is Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 70 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. This week, I want to talk about some cool flash storage solutions for my beautiful A1200 here. Now that we got the keyboard working, thought we'd give it a workout. Many of us started our Amiga 1200s with the traditional 2.5-inch IDE hard drives, and those worked fine. But they're like 25 years old now, and they tend to only last about 8 or 10 years before they start to fail. And they're getting harder and harder to come by. So many of us, probably I would say most of us, have switched to a CF card solution. Something like this little beauty here. This one came from RetroReady.1. Just a little adapter converts the IDE into a CF card. And those work pretty good. But CF cards were made for things like cameras and such, and not really designed for the constant writing and rewriting and random access of a hard drive. It's just not what they were designed for. They do a good job, but it's not quite their forte. They also occasionally fail. I myself, in the past year and a half, have had at least 2 CF cards just lose their formatting. One of them on my Amiga 1200 on my PCMCIA slot. One of them on, I think it was my ACA 500 Plus. Yeah, that was it. Just lose its formatting. No apparent reason. Now, I'm honestly a little more abusive with my system than most people because I'm constantly taking things out, moving them, trying them in other machines. You know, to give you guys the best possible entertainment experience, I destroy my own equipment. So I started looking at some options. Now last year I tried an IDE to SATA solution, and that really didn't work very well. I had bad luck with that. So recently I found 2 more solutions that actually work pretty good. The first one is a DOM, or Disk On Module. This one's made by our friends at Amiga on the Lake, and it is a little flash storage device, very similar in theory to Compact Flash, but it's designed for industrial type equipment, things that are maybe oily and greasy in the air, and you don't want anything with moving parts. You don't want anything to get jolted or vibrations. This one comes with a standard 44-pin female IDE connector, and you can also get it with a little adapter. You just plug it in there and it turns it into a male connector. So if you want to connect it to a cable or a secondary device or something like that, you can do it either way. But this way, it hooks right up to the motherboard. Take a look. Now for the second time in a week, we're taking a look at the guts of my Amiga 1200. This time concentrating on the little IDE connector right here. Now this is an unbuffered interface, which means it basically hooks directly up to the chips. And you also have to be careful whenever you do anything that you put things in properly. There's pin 1 right at the end here. And with the DOMs, or the Disk On modules, you want it facing this way. Now let's take a look here. Make sure we get it on all the pins. Not only we want it to face the right way, we want to make sure it gets on all the pins. Now if you put these in backwards, it's not usually going to hurt anything. It should be just fine, but don't make a practice of it. Now, look how nice and neat and tidy that is with that Disk On module in there. We're just going to do a little tour of it there. Look how nice that fits in. Beautiful, huh? Now, the other cool thing about this, like I mentioned, the IDE interface is not buffered on the Amiga 1200, which means you have to use a very, very short cable. They recommend a 2-inch cable, maybe a 4-inch. You go any longer than that, there's a chance of data loss. Now, if you have a buffered interface, like maybe a 4X EIDE or another buffered type interface, I'll show you in a minute, you have to worry about that less because it buffers the signals. But this is perfect because, man, it is right on there on the bus. Now let's just turn this little guy and see how fast she boots. All of my tests are done today with Amiga OS 3.1.4 and use 3.1.4 ROMs. I do this because 3.1 and before do not play nice with larger hard drives without some software jiggery pokery. 3.1.4 sees them just fine. All of the devices I'm going to show you today, I've already installed Workbench 3.1.4, the best Workbench utilities from Gulliver, and lastly, the 3.1.4.1 update. So all of them are already pre-formatted and pre-configured. Let me show you the guts. Now, in HD Toolbox, this is an 8 gig drive, and you'll see I have it partitioned in two 4 gigabyte partitions. I always keep my boot partitions under 4 gigs. It's just something I do. I'm using 100 buffers, and I'm also using a file system block size of 4 kilobytes right here. All right, what this does is it creates a smaller bitmap in memory when the Amiga boots and saves some memory when it boots, and it also makes the system verify faster if it has to go through a verification procedure. The second drive or work drive, I just store some files on. I'm only using 30 buffers here, and I tend to use a larger block size. Because this is a 4 gig partition, I'm using 4096, but on my other devices that are bigger, I'll use an 8K or even a 16K partition here. Now, the Amiga itself is using a 68040 Blizzard card with 64 megabytes of RAM. Now, this does affect the drive performance. It doesn't improve the drive performance, but not by as much as you would think, because we're limited to the lame implementation of IDE on the Amiga 1200, which uses PIO0. Now, this was not unheard of in 1992, as IDE was still a fairly fresh technology. But soon after this, a lot of competitors started using PIO 1, 2, 3, or 4, which makes the drives much faster. You can have the fastest drive in the world and still be held back by the Amiga's sub 2 megabyte per second IDE speed. There are solutions to speed it up. Jens from Individual Computers has some accelerators that have an IDE booster that can dramatically improve performance by using some type of voodoo on your Amiga. And other third-party speed-up cards exist too. IDE is also dumber than SCSI. With SCSI on the A3000 or with a card, the Amiga can give a command to fetch some stuff, and the SCSI bus can happily go do that, leaving the CPU free to do other things. With IDE, the CPU has to monitor and control everything, which means other things slow down while the IDE drive is accessed. Kind of selfish, really. This is why my A3000 with its 030 25 MHz and SCSI interface can sometimes feel so much faster than my 040 based A1200. Now, we already saw that the disk-on module boots nice and fast, about 12 seconds with a fairly bare bones install. Not too bad, really. Now, I test the disk performance in two ways. Number one, with this program called Disk Speed by Michael Sins of MKSoft Development. This utility takes about 8 minutes to run, and what it does is it starts by writing and creating directories on the disk using file sizes from 512 bytes up to 256 kilobytes using different kinds of RAM-based buffers. So it gives you a nice overall average of the speed of the disk. Now, some devices excel at reading, others at writing. It also measures the amount of CPU time free during the exercise, and IDE will always use a fair chunk of CPU time during use. I'll be measuring and comparing all three of the devices I'm testing. But I did find one interesting thing about the disk-on module. Out of all of them, it left the CPU available more than any other device, and I'm not quite sure why. The next test is a real-world test. What I have on the drive. Let's do a list. I've got the future was 8bit.cdxl file, which is about, in total, about a 36 megabyte file. I'm going to copy this to RAM, and I'm going to measure the time it takes to copy it to RAM, and then I copy it back to the hard disk in another folder, and I time that in order to get an average time of reading and writing directly from the disk device into RAM. And again, I'm going to do this on all three devices. And it's just a simple little copy. The future was 8bit.cdxl to RAM. And then I start my stopwatch, and I just literally count the number of seconds it takes to copy it over. Then I copy it back into another folder on the hard drive, see how long that takes, and I'll document that. Next up is a really cool device that I've actually been looking for a while now. It is an IDE SSD drive. And this one is made by Janssen, okay? So it's a PATA, parallel ATA, SSD drive, 32 gigabytes. Now I've been looking for these for years. I've found some online. They're either not available or terribly expensive, like $200-250 for a small one. But the other day I was looking for one for a customer who needed them in a $500,000 CNC machine. We had to replace the IDE drives in there. I popped on Amazon and lo and behold, there were 64 gig and 32 gig versions of this card. I ordered two 64 gig ones from my customer and a 32 gig one for myself so I could do these tests. Now this drive is rated at 108 megabytes per second, but you're never going to get that on an Amiga. With the A1200, if you can get 2 megabytes per second out of it, you know, if the Amiga's pointed downhill and there's a strong crosswind behind it, maybe you'll get 2 megabytes per second, but never any more than that. Now these use the standard 44-pin IDE interface that the Amiga 600 and Amiga 1200 uses. I was concerned about these because when I tried my SATA to IDE interface, it would not work with any SATA drives because the SSD SATA drives don't even communicate in PIO 0. They're limited to like PIO 3 or 4 and above, and so the Amiga would not really even recognize it. And I was worried about the same thing here. But I plugged this little guy in, bam, sees it just like that, formats it perfectly, and I'm just in Amiga heaven. Now you'll notice this has a 6-inch cable, and I already said a non-buffered Amiga 1200 really should have about a 2-inch cable. Do you think I can find my cable? No. It's probably sitting right next to my Amiga 3000 power supply and my keyboard clip from my Amiga 1200, both of which have been missing for years. I don't know where they are. But this one came with a pretty long 8-inch IDE cable. I was a little worried about it, but I plugged it in. Works perfect. Haven't had a single problem with it. I do have some 2-inch cables on order. They should be here in a week or two, and I'll swap it out at that time. Back into the Amiga guts. You have to make sure that everything's hooked up the right way. If you look, there's 4 little pins right there. The red mark in the cable goes that direction. That's pin 1 on these particular drives. Then you want the red stripe to, of course, line up here. Now, traditionally, you're going to mount your 2.5-inch drive in your little drive tray that came with your Amiga 1200. I don't have mine available right now, and I'm swapping things in and out, so I'm just going to set it aside for the moment, but it is connected right up there. All of these devices we're talking about, boot time from the time I give it power is between 12 and 14 seconds. That's pretty reliable. So it's fast at booting without a doubt. This feels good to work with. I've formatted the drive. I've got a work partition of 26 gigabytes and about a 4 gigabyte data or workbench partition, so that works fine. But I've set up my workbench exactly the same as my other drive, and what we'll do is we just run the same tests. We go into disk speed and let it do its job, and I'll document all of that, and I will show you those results in a few minutes. Now, with the SSD drive, I really think one of the benefits is going to be that that drive is designed for millions of reads and millions of writes, so I think it will tend to be more reliable than the CF card. It's also available in 32 or 64 gig varieties that I was able to find, where the disk-on module, these tend to only be available in 4, 8, or 16 gig sizes. So if you want more space, the SSD is a reasonable way to go and probably a little bit more reliable than a CF card. Next is an old friend, the CF card adapter. And this is simply a little IDE interface in the bottom and a CF card interface there. This is about as simple as you can get it. They do have more complex versions out there, of which I like this one too. This one not only has the CF interface, but it also has a 40-pin IDE interface. So if I wanted to hook up something like an IDE CD-ROM, I theoretically could do it. It's got a little jumper on there where it will emulate a 4X eIDE, use that software, and enable the second IDE port. It's pretty cool. I've clocked the two of them side by side. They're about the same speed. I thought maybe the buffered one would be a touch faster, within 2, 3, 4% of each other. Now, word of warning about CF card interfaces. Some of them will come and they'll say that they have a master and slave jumper on it. So you'd think you can put a secondary IDE device on there. From my experience, it doesn't work very well. Now, this one does because it's got the 4X IDE built into it. So it actually has two completely separate IDE interfaces. But if you're just sharing one like this and you want to go in a master-slave situation, it probably won't work. Now, like I mentioned, CF cards are designed for cameras and things like that, not for constant writing and rewriting 1,000 times a day. So that's why I'm concerned they just don't have the robustness to last in the long haul. Some people have bad luck with certain brands of CF cards. I use the SanDisk cards. Those seem to have a pretty good reputation, and they always work. They're always recognized. Now again, I've lost the formatting on 2 of them in the past year. I don't know if it's because they were SanDisk or what, but it happens. You can get CF cards in fairly high capacities. The most common ones are going to be your 4 gig, 8 gig, 16 gig, and maybe 32 gig. But you can find 64 gig and 128 gig. Full disclosure, I've never used one in my Amiga bigger than 16 gig. I haven't needed it. If I want huge amounts of storage, I use my Amiga 4000, and that's got plenty of storage on it. But for my Amiga 1200, I've got all my programs. I've got a bunch of WHD load games. A 16 gig card, I'm not even close to filling that up yet. Now, the other benefit of a CF card is that it's so easy just to open the case, pop the card out, throw it in your PC on a card reader, launch WinUAE, and tell it to recognize your CF card, copy things back and forth between your PC on WinUAE and your CF card all day long, plug it back in. Super easy to do in the overall scheme of things. Now, of course, you can do that with these other devices. I could get a USB to IDE interface and plug this little disk-on module in. It'd work fine. But most of you are probably not going to have that kind of interface handy. Now, performance has always been great with my CF cards. Boot time's about the same, 12 to 14 seconds. I'm not going to show you the picture of installing it because, like I said, all of you already have one of these CF cards in your machine, and you've seen mine before. So let's get right to the test results and see what we came up with. And here we have the results of our hard work here. What we've got, the first column is the DOM, which is the disk-on module. Second column is the SSD drive. Third column is the CF card. It does each of these tests in order, and I've highlighted in orange the particular one that won that specific test. And at the end, we'll come up with a score called an SOH score, which stands for Scientific Orange Highlights. And we'll see which one wins. Now, we've got some interesting bits of data here. Like here, we have on the disk-on module, we have only 14 files created per second, where the other two devices were 46 and 53 files per second. So the disk-on module has a harder time creating new files. And I ran this a couple times, but this brings up a very, very interesting point that I'm not sure where it comes from. On the disk-on module, almost without fail, the CPU availability is much, much higher than the other ones. Like here, 81% CPU available, 22% CPU available, 5% CPU available, which means although it's transferring the data maybe slower, it's creating things slower, it's leaving more CPU time available. I'm not sure why. Maybe it has something to do with the non-buffered interface and being directly connected to the bus. But as we scroll down here, you'll see a lot of the Scientific Orange highlights on the right column, which is the CF card. You'll find on the disk-on module, it often wins on reading from a file, and it'll win by a fair amount, maybe 8% or so, but it loses out every single time on creating and writing files. It's substantially slower, and the compact flash almost always wins on creating and writing files, seldom wins on reading files. It's either disk on module or the SSD that wins on reading the files. So as we go down our scientific test here, what we have is the disk on module won 12 of the points. Okay, its SOH, its scientific orange highlight is 12. The SSD is 21 times it won, and the CF card is 42. This actually surprised me, and it's mainly because the CF card creates and writes files substantially faster than the other two, but does not necessarily read them faster. Now, as far as the data transfer for the 36 megabyte file to and from RAM, the disk on module transferred to RAM in 27 seconds, and from RAM back to the hard drive in 27 and a half. The SSD was 31 seconds to transfer it to RAM and 29 seconds to write it back. And the CF card was 30.7 seconds to transfer it, 28.5 to send it back. That kind of proves a theory here. I mentioned that the actual data transfer of the disk on module is pretty good in the overall scheme of things, especially with large files. And it won on the file transfer test, 27 seconds to transfer the files. The other was 29, 30, 28 seconds. Very interesting, actually. To be honest, those results actually surprised me a little bit. The CF card was the clear winner in many of the categories, but interesting things that I found. I find that the disk on module was often faster when reading from the drive with somewhat larger files. The disk on module would often win in that case, which is probably why it beat everybody in the copy test with the big 36 megabyte CDXL file, because it was dealing with just a big piece of data and just moving it. But when it comes to small things like creating the folders, where it only got 14 files per second when it was creating folders, and the other ones were up in the 40s and 50s, it must have a bigger issue writing small things repeatedly, because that's usually where it lost. This does not mean the device feels slow. It feels incredibly fast. And if you recall, it claimed the CPU was more free than either of the other two devices. And that may be why when I'm using the disk on module, the whole thing feels zippy. It's accessing the hard drive, but it's using less CPU to do it, leaving more free for everything else, giving you the feeling that everything's running faster. So even though it's the slowest, it may be a good choice anyways. The SSD card excelled with small files. All of the 512 byte files, it won in almost every category of the little 512 byte files. So when you're dealing with something small, lots of things back and forth repeated, that's the clear winner. When you're dealing with mid and larger size files, the CF card seemed to win every time. Now, I didn't know if maybe there was a difference between my two adapters, so I tested it with both adapters. Like I said, they came out about the same. So it's just the CF cards are pretty zippy. Now, balance that with the fact that they're theoretically less reliable, who knows? So my final opinions. The disk on module is awesome. It feels fast. It's so small. If you want just something tiny to stick in there and keep out of your way, you can't beat it. And it feels fast, even though it lost the competition. I also like it because it's industrial and in theory should last longer than a CF card. The SSD drive's awesome. Performance is great. I know it came in second place, but it feels fast when you're running it. Would I get different results if I had a 2-inch cable instead of the 6 or 8-inch cable? Maybe. I'll have to rerun it. Maybe I'd get even better results that way. Where I think it will shine is in reliability. I think you could keep that in there for 5, 10, 15 years. You'll probably be just fine because they're designed to work as hard drives. The CF cards are proven success. Cheap and cheerful. Stick it in there. Obviously, you get great performance because it won in a majority of the tests. You just have to concern yourself with the fact that it may not last quite as long. So do backups, make sure you've got backups of it, back it up to WinUAE if you need to, just in case you have to recreate it. But it's a nice, cheap and cheerful way to go. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my awesome patrons. And if you'd like to become a patron of 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast for as little as $2 a month, just head on over to patreon.com/10mark, and I would love to have you there. Lots of perks available, including this one. Also, don't forget that 10-mark merchandise, the t-shirts, the cups, the stickers, are available on my son's website. Sales have been going along nice and brisk. Pretty proud of the kid for that. The website's right here, and here's a little picture of the kind of stuff you can find on there, and I'll also have the link in the description. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment down below. Please let me know what storage solution you're using on your Amiga 1200 or your Amiga 600. I'd love to hear about it. Love to hear the kind of performance you can get, and really love to hear if you have one of Yen's utilities on his accelerator cards that speeds it up. I'd love to hear just how fast you can get out of that. But for now, this is Doug from 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, signing out.